everyone, and welcome to the Invasive Species Center webinar series. My name is Kristen Palionis, and I am the Policy and Program Development Intern at the Invasive Species Center, and I will be your moderator for today. I acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, home of Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, and the Métis Nation. The Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit organization that connects stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. We have a number of excellent invasive species resources on our website. Check us online at invasivespeciescenter.ca. You can find best management practices, species profiles, video resources, and much more. You can also sign up for future webinars, our quarterly newsletter, The Spread, and our bi-weekly media research and event scan. You can also find all sorts of invasive species events and webinars going on through our website. If you're interested in listening to our past webinars in the series or other program webinars, you can visit the Invasive Species Center's YouTube page. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube page once it's been concluded. The next webinar part of this series will be on Thursday, October 22nd at 1 p.m., providing an update on beach leaf disease in Ontario, with Sharon Reid from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry as the speaker. You can register for this webinar by visiting invasivespeciescenter.ca. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I have a few logistical items to go over. There will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, so if you have a question at any time, please type it in the question box and I will read it to our presenter after the webinar. You can also email us at info@invasivespeciescenter.ca. If you're having technical difficulties at any time, please type them in the chat box or send me an email, which you would have received with your registration, and we will try to resolve it for you. Lastly, there will be a brief survey following the webinar. If you could take some time to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. Today's webinar is titled Ontario Invasive Species Enforcement Update, and I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Brenda Koenig from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Brenda is a Provincial Enforcement Specialist in the Enforcement Branch at the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and has been in that role since 2014. She works with field officers in program areas such as policy to provide interpretation of the law and improve implementation. Her portfolio includes invasive species and fisheries. Thank you, Brenda, for joining us today, and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody today. I noticed from just looking over the people that have signed in, we have people from across different agencies across Ontario and also our neighbors down to the south. So welcome, everyone. At the outset, I would like to say thank you for coordinating this. I do understand a little bit more about what it takes to roll out one of these webinars, just from learning some of the behind the scenes things that need to happen. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I hope for some of you, this will be entirely new information. You may never have seen one of these presentations on enforcement before. For others, I know you may have seen iterations of this presentation in the past, so I have tried to update wherever possible, but recognizing that there may be some similarities that you might see if you have seen a previous presentation on enforcement regarding invasive species in Ontario. So just to jump into the presentation, I'll give you just a little bit of background. I've been with Enforcement Branch since 2014. Before that, I was working up in policy section of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and my portfolio was bait. So I was working on that file for a number of years, and before that, I did have some experience out in the field. mostly for academic research, but also for environmental consulting. So fairly varied perspective on things from some of the work I've done. But the work that we're doing in enforcement branch currently, one of our priorities is aquatic invasive species, and I'm happy to share information with you on that today. And just as a reminder, if you do have any questions, please hold them for the end. I'm happy to have a discussion at that point in time, and hopefully I can answer the questions. One of the things I'd like to reiterate is that as a provincial enforcement specialist, members of our team and myself work very closely with policy representatives and also field officers. We are kind of a liaison between the two. So policy, of course, is responsible for developing the policy that stands behind the rules that are in place, and the other end of that spectrum is that field officers are the ones that are responsible for enforcing those laws. So just an overview of today's presentation. I will be providing a bit of a very slight background on invasive species in Ontario as that relates to what enforcement branch has been doing. Also leading into what enforcement branch has done to address invasive species and what they are currently doing to respond, and then touch on some work that we've done in terms of partnerships and also partnership approaches or collaborative approaches to enforcement through the years. Invasive species history in Ontario, why are we concerned about invasive species? I use this slide quite frequently when I give presentations to, for example, usually we go to college classes and in particular Sir Sanford Fleming students and try to explain why there is a focus on aquatic invasive species from an enforcement perspective in Ontario. One thing that doesn't really jump out at people is that, when you think of a game warden, it's sort of perspective that they deal with hook and bullet issues, and moving into invasive species has been a relatively recent thing in terms of the types of rules we've been able to implement, but certainly not in terms of some of the rules we've had in the past in Ontario in terms of trying to prevent the spread of invasive species. So for example, in Ontario, we've had a rule in place for close to 40 years prohibiting the importation of certain types of live bait. So that's definitely, something that's been long-standing. And then our newer rules are going to be the subject of some of the things I'm talking about today. So what are the risk factors for Ontario? Obviously, there's a huge amount of trade that goes on. Up until recently, there was widespread global travel. Of course, that's an interesting kind of experiment now to try to see what sort of impact COVID has had on things that are being shipped back and forth and how that might change in the future. Ontario has proximity to the Great Lakes and an awful a lot of shipping. And of course, the other part of Ontario is that, or the aspect of Ontario is that, if you drive across it, you will see an incredible diversity in geography from one end of the province to the other. And, you appreciate that when you go from southern Ontario up to, places like Cochrane or Thunder Bay, the difference in demographics as well. The other aspects that maybe are not as commonly in the forefront, but we certainly need to think about, are that there are elements of Ontario that are unique, and one of the reasons I have the picture of the brook trout there is just to remind us of that. So what's at stake in terms of aquatic perspective? We have 250,000 inland lakes and thousands of kilometers of streams and rivers that could be impacted by invasive species if they take hold. Ontario has jurisdiction over parts of the Great Lakes, 4 of them. Fishing and economy is a very important industry, the commercial fishery in Ontario. And just for some stats there, on an annual basis, in Ontario, we have approximately 1.3 million anglers that engage in the activity, and more than $2.5 billion are spent on fisheries-related expenditures in the province. So lots at stake. And if you look on the slide to the right, of course, there's some key numbers. Some of them do have shock value. Ontario is #1 in having more invasive species than any other province or territory. There's 440 invasive plants in southern Ontario alone. That's one thing that I notice. I travel a fair bit of ground when I'm out hiking or horseback riding, and just looking at things like the spread of dog strangling vine over the last few years has been quite alarming. And some other statistics there. So I think we're at 184 non-native and invasive species in the Great Lakes right now. So those are just some reference points to set the stage for why we're concerned about invasive species in Ontario. We have a history of invasive species management over the years. I did, of course, quote that we have had some rules in place for close to 40 years. Some other partnerships that have been in place for a very long time include the Partnership for the Invading Species Awareness Program, and also more recently with the Invasive Species Center. So the Ontario Federation Anglers and Hunters has been a partner since 1992, providing information and outreach on invasive species, how to prevent the spread and slow the spread, and getting messaging out there. Collaboration on other levels, of course, also does occur, and it extends, of course, beyond being just within, agencies within Ontario, but also international perspectives as well. In terms of legislation, and I'll just speak a little bit to that, maybe even more in the next slide, but in what's at play in Ontario, the key pieces of legislation that we have. Of course, right now we have our Provincial Invasive Species Act 2015. That was when it was enacted. It came into force in 2016. There are federal aquatic invasive species regulations, and when I say federal, they apply across Canada. They are under the Fisheries Act, and they have some rules in place that came into force in 2015. And then, of course, we also have the Ontario fishery regulations that are also under the Fisheries Act. They have a number of rules that pertain to the spread of invasive species, and there are some overlaps amongst these pieces of legislation. One that is not mentioned in addition, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides, is the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act. We have under that piece the Ontario regulation that speaks to fish licensing, and there is a piece under there that prohibits the sale of gobies. So just a little bit of a timeline for you here to set the stage. So what have we in place in terms of legislation and policy, and when were they put into place? So going back to as far as 2004, we have had laws that ban the sale and possession of live invasive fish. So back in 2004, it was recognized that invasive fish were an issue. And when I say invasive fish, we're talking about the Asian carps, the gobies, the rough rudd, and the snakehead. Ontario, it takes a little bit of time to change the Ontario fishery regulations because it is done in conjunction and under the purvey of the federal government, fisheries and oceans. So To respond to this threat, Ontario changed its own OREG 66498, that's fish licensing, which I mentioned is under the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act. And so we changed that to prohibit the sale, the live sale of those species of fish because it was recognized as a threat. And within a couple of years, the possession of live invasive fish was then also prohibited. And so as we move forward in time, there was a fair bit of work done in terms of looking at how should we approach invasive species in Ontario. There's the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan was released in 2012, and things really ramped up from that time to the point where, as I mentioned, Ontario passed the Ontario Invasive Species Act in 2015. It came into force in 2016 along with a regulation under that act, and those both came into force November of 2016. A little bit earlier than that, the aquatic invasive species regulations came into force in 2015, and the aquatic invasive species regulations changed the landscape a little bit because they required that things like Asian carp could no longer just be dead to be sold. They needed to be dead and eviscerated. And that was a landscape sort of level approach, which ties into some of the work that we had been doing with the Law Enforcement Committee. It was really some lobbying from the Law Enforcement Committee, which I'll get to sort of towards the end of the slide deck, that led to that development. There were also consequential amendments that were made in the Ontario fishery regulations, so a change in the terminology from invasive fish to invasive species. And there are rules in the Ontario fishery regulations and the aquatic invasive species regulations that are mimicking each other. They're very similar. Just another set of tools in our basket of goodies we can use to fight invasive species. We usually like to remind people about compliance to rules. One of the things that I think it is important to remember is that it's not just enforcement staff that are responsible, and most people are aware of this, but we all have a role to play in promoting compliance to the rules. And you can see that this is sort of laid out in a spectrum here, from going from left to right, where on the left, it's sort of less impact. It's more of a friendly approach to promoting compliance, and when things progress, or if they are at a level where that approach is not working or not effective, then you carry on and you move to the right, where it gets more impactful, and there would be things like warnings and charges. So obviously we try to start with promoting awareness of the rules, educating people. There's also, there may be a role for training for people who are being or of the regulated sector, or incentives may be provided. And this end of the spectrum is really the part where there's no special powers required to promote compliance or provide education. You don't need any special authority to do that. There's a lot of collaborative work that's done with policy to develop messaging, but policy and also field staff, people who are issuing licenses, they all have a role to play in helping people attain compliance. So just to give you a little bit of history on, how did Ontario enforce the new rules then back in 2015 and 2016. And I just want to add a point here that at that time, the Provincial Act definitely was quite new in 2016. The aquatic invasive species regulations were new in 2015 in that they required that things that were being sold, like Asian carp, were not just dead, but they were also eviscerated or gutted. That aspect was new. There were elements of rules, though, that weren't new. So there were rules that we had in place for a while under the Ontario fishery regulations around invasive fish that were now being called invasive species, just a change in terminology, but that the possession of those was not allowed. So when we approached, implementing the new act, obviously for those aspects that were new, our first step really would be to promote awareness of the rules and encourage people to voluntarily comply. And it still kind of kept the door open in case we needed to take enforcement actions for significant non-compliance issues. So where someone maybe had a compliance history of not following the rules, there were definitely options for dealing with that. So conservation officers were able to deal with offenses by, responding to illegal activities, things like possessing and transporting prohibited invasive species, responding to urgent threats where compliance actions might have been necessary, and also, looking to see if people were following the rules through inspection and enforcement measures where needed. So how has our approach changed to the present day? It hasn't really changed that much. Invasive species and compliance promotion is still very much based in education and outreach first. If we can do that, with being quite proactive by using various communications opportunities to let people know what the rules are and reaching out. And when I say we, that's the royal we. It's not just enforcement, but it's also working with policy and other program areas to respond to promote compliance. Just going to step into giving a little bit of background, and this is where you may see some elements if you've been tuned in before that are you've probably seen before, but it's just to cover off some of the stuff we've done in the past and how it led us into present day enforcement activities around invasive species. So in the past, I've already mentioned a few times, but it really was a focus on Asian carp. It was back in, around 2010 and forward, there really was an issue that was identified with fish being brought in. The rule was that they had to be dead, not that they had to be eviscerated. But the concern and what was being found in the field was that people were bringing them, the haulers were bringing them across from the States. Just before they got to the border, they were live fish. They would pull the plug, drain the water out. There was very often ice being shipped with the fish. And those fish, when you say dead, what does dead mean? So those fish were being found to survive the removal of the water, and because the body temperatures were being kept quite low through ice, many times there were live fish actually being brought across the border. And the interest in that for commercial people who are selling fish commercially, of course, is to keep them as fresh as possible. However, it really wasn't meeting our needs. There were some fish, I know it was sort of monitored that they stayed alive for close to 48 hours on ice, no water. So there was considerable effort given to checking international border crossings and also food fish markets to make sure that the fish that were being sold were in fact dead. And you can see by a summary of the hours that were spent across some of those years. So the little chart summarizes that, in the 2010-2011 fiscal year, close to 1,700 hours, a little bit more in the next year. And then it started to tail off in 2013 and 2014. And part of that, we do think was because there were a lot of inspections being done. There were a number of charges that were laid and convictions that were attained. So the message was getting out that you can't bring live or close to dead fish into Ontario. just a summary here between 2005 and 2013. So we had 20 convictions on 14 different entities. So they were 14 different companies or sellers. Most of this activity was in the Greater Toronto area. In terms of the fines, some of the fines that we had in that area for fish markets, just over $105,000 in fines, and border work, a significant, almost double that, so just over 200,000 in fines. In terms of the number of Asian carp seized, or the quantity that we seized, so just over 40,000 pounds. So a significant amount of work on Asian carp during the time period sort of leading up to 2014, 2015. So enforcement priorities, and just to close the door on that, final comment about the Asian carp. Of course, in 2015, we did have the aquatic invasive species regulations that came into force, and they changed the background level for activity on that front, because then Asian carp had to be dead and eviscerated. So it sort of became not so much of a concern anymore in terms of people seem to be following the rules a little bit better once those rules came into play. So just jumping into the enforcement priorities. So how have we structured our work? We do have what we call a priority or an action plan that they've been in play from 2015 until currently. And so, what is this all about? So we have focused enforcement priorities. The pictures on the right identify or cue you into what those are. There's actually currently 5, but one of them was just added in the last couple of years, and it's about enhancing partnerships and communication. But I just thought I'd mention the ones that are more pertaining to the field. So we've got one that focuses on illegal trade and commercialization. Initially, that was a focus on endangered species, but now that's shifted a little bit, of course, because we don't really have the Endangered Species Act anymore. That has gone over to another ministry. One of the other priorities is about moose. So it's looking at compliance with selective harvest regulations, making sure, or trying to make sure that people are following the rules with what they're supposed to be harvesting cow-calf wise. And hunting safety, we did have a blip in, I believe it was 2013, 2014 that led up to this. There was a bit of a spike in hunting incidents. And when we say incidents, we're talking about where someone was shot or injured significantly, where they would require a hospital visit. And so part of that priority related to trying to address why these things were going on and trying to reduce the number of occurrences that we had for hunting incidents. And then aquatic invasive species, of course, which is the subject for today's discussion. So the enforcement priorities have specific tactics and targets that are associated with them. This approach does encompass priorities for everybody who works in enforcement branch. So it's not just for one, particular section. It's not just for field officers. It's also for the section I work in, which is the regulatory support unit. So what things are we able to do to support meeting the objectives under these priorities? The other aspect of this is that there's focused record keeping and reporting. So we really want to understand what we've done and what we've achieved. And we also want to know if our work has resulted in the expected effect. And we can take this information and improve techniques in areas where we can by looking back on it and saying, okay, well, this year, these things worked or these things didn't work, and how can we change our approach? The other point I want to make here is that work beyond these topics is still important. Of course, we're not saying that we're not dealing with other issues as they come up, but it's not planned for or monitored or reported on in the same way. So these 4 priorities are are the current ones moving forward. And I do want to spend some time just talking about some of the strategies that we're using underneath the aquatic invasive species priority. So one of the things that through discussion we were looking at, frequency of occurrence of things happening, non-compliance. We're also looking at risk of non-compliance. So, looking at an individual thing that might happen and what the impact might be. And from some of these discussions and analyses, we did land on focusing our efforts on 4 industries that we thought would be potential pathways for aquatic invasive species to enter or spread in Ontario. And those are listed here. So one long-standing one, quite familiar with, of course, is the movement and use of live bait fish. Pet and aquarium supplies were another aspect that we thought could be a venue for bringing things into the province, as well as water garden supplies. And again, another long-standing one is the sale of food fish, which we were, of course, quite familiar with from doing some of the Asian carp work and also other work as it relates to sale of fish in Ontario. So we have a multi-year action plan, as I mentioned, to address these potential risks. And we have strategies and objectives under this plan to basically tell us how to guide the operationalization of the tactics so that we can attain our objectives. I'm going to go through those strategies just leading into this now on the next slide. So one of the strategies that is contained in the plan is about increasing staff awareness. And so staff awareness, we are not just referring to conservation officers, we're also referring to other staff and enforcement branch, such as Provincial Enforcement Specialists, managers who are operating as supervisors for the field staff, and other staff in MNRRF as required could receive training as well. So, what do we do along this objective? A number of activities have taken place. One of the first things we realized as the Provincial Invasive Species Act was going to be coming into force in November of 2016, that we really needed to make sure that our officers understood the Act and also the regulation, the rules underneath it. So what we did was developed a self-directed learning package on the Act and its regulation. Essentially, it was about 24 questions, I think we had, where an officer or a manager could work through this at their desk with a copy of the legislation in front of them and answer questions that were posed. And so really this was to ensure a familiarity with the powers and authorities under the Act. As a follow-up to that, everyone who had completed the self-directed learning in their individual work units were required to have a meeting where everybody met together and discussed any questions that came up, and if there were follow-up required, that was then forwarded on to the regulatory support unit, to myself, to try to answer or provide direction on. That was one of the first things that we did, was the self-directed learning. In terms of new officers coming on board, there's a couple of ways that we address making sure that they're aware of what the rules are. We sometimes have what we call foundations training. It's a 2-week period where officers are trained in various pieces of legislation. So we would have an aspect in that training that would cover off invasive species. Otherwise, we can also provide them with the self-directed learning and follow-up one-to-one. We have also done face-to-face follow-up training, which is more about being able to identify invasive species. And so we did that in 2018 with the Invasive Species Center and had 2 sessions. One was in Sudbury, one was in Toronto. In fact, we also had fishery officers from Fisheries and Oceans, CFO, attend that session. And there were a lot of very positive feedback from that face-to-face training, and that you know, there were some officers that said they learned more in that short session face-to-face about invasive species than they had through other mechanisms, just because they were able to see some of the specimens, to talk with people about how to identify them. So those were very successful. Another tool we've developed is something called a conservation officer's legislation tool, COLT for short. This is a more recent development. This is a tool that offers guidance to officers on legislative intent and the appropriate application of scope sections of our natural resource legislation. So there is a big chunk in there on invasive species. It's designed with the goal of improving understanding, and it provides access to resources, and it also is a way of you know, retaining institutional knowledge within enforcement branch. So that's been a very positive recent development. Increasing staff awareness. One of the more recent things that we are considering doing is an enforcement branch information series. And this essentially is an interactive volunteering training opportunity that would be available for anybody in the enforcement branch. Sometimes we invite people from outside our branch as well, to give them information on relevant and timely topics. So it really is an adaptive training model, and what I mean by that is it's a way to deliver information virtually during a time where travel may not be allowed or possible. It's recorded, so the presentation with the discussion is available after the sessions for anybody who might have missed it, but we do usually offer 2 sessions so that there's some flexibility for people to attend. We do have 2 sessions planned in the future. So one is on aquatic invasive species identification, and one is an overview of the legislative controls. And those are planned for next spring. You can see the pictures of the quick reference guides at the bottom here. And these were handed out or sent to all of our officers in preparation for this information session. The series was supposed to be held in May, but because of COVID, we've had to postpone it. But these quick reference guides were sent out to everybody just to queue them up for that training. And notably that the quick reference guides, they were developed in partnership with the Invasive Species Center and also the Invading Species Awareness Program. All right, so under Strategy 2, and what is Strategy 2? So Strategy 2 is about increasing awareness of new rules through outreach, education, and promotion. And the difference here is that the intended target for this, of course, is the public and the regulated sector. So, and any commercial entities that might be affected by this. So what have we done with this? In 2017, we, with policy help, developed this accordion type brochure, and it was sent to all officers across the province in the fall of 2017 to help promote awareness of the rules for invasive species. So multiple copies were sent so they could hand these out at stakeholder events, or if they were doing an inspection, they could hand these out so that people would have a quick sort of guide to what the rules were. At that point, before that time, we didn't really have a summary of all the rules in one place. That was something that you could hand out easily. So this brochure really focused on not only the provincial invasive species rules, but also the federal rules. So all the rules that might be in play, and refers people to websites for more information, and also provides information on the reporting line as well, or how to report a suspected violation. Just continuing on in the same theme, what other things have been done to increase awareness? We did use various platforms to make people aware of what the rules were, and I'll just highlight that some of them where we we saw that we could have a good exchange of information, of course, is in the fishing regulation summary. So the recreational fishing regulation summary that is released every year. We did put ads into that. You'll see the anglers ads on the left and middle of the screen. Those were in the fishing regulation summary over a number of years. And of course, we did change some of the messaging. So at the beginning, when it was new, we had the sort of red and blue ad up at the top left that was warning people, sort of in terms of warning, saying, hey, we've got a new act. There are rules under it. They might apply to you. Pay attention. And then some more specific messaging as we went on over the years. We also used various social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook to get the message out there. And it does seem to be working. We do continue to get a number of questions that come through from these platforms about what the rules are. And finally, this is a buck note, and lots of people say, what's a buck note? Well, before the loonie came out, we had dollar bills, and buck notes are roughly the size of a dollar bill, but they're really just a small flyer. We were planning to attend the Toronto Sportsman show this spring, but that was preempted by COVID. But this was a buck note that was intended to be handed out at the show. Because of COVID, of course, we couldn't do that. We will be using these in the future when it becomes possible to hand things out again. So looking at strategy 3, and I'm going to actually just morph this right into strategy 4, but basically strategy 3 was to understand basically the movement and potential markets of invasive species. So this is really about information collection and the use of intelligence processes. And what I mean by that is verifying the information to try to inform some of the activities we might do in the field. And so strategy 4 was around inspecting for compliance. And so again, we have the first parts of that, which are promoting awareness, and then it's going out and checking to see if people are following the rules or not. And if you remember, the pathways we identified, of course, were pet shops and water and garden suppliers, the live bait fish pathway, and also commercial food fish pathways. And in some cases, we did use a focused approach. What we mean by that, in some cases where it was appropriate, we may have used a blitz, an enforcement blitz to check places. So one of the things I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about is a development that we've had quite recently, and that was the use of a compliance order that was issued this year. So what is a compliance order? And I just want to take a step back because I was just talking about inspections, but one of the things we find we're often responding to are tips. And so we have people calling in with information or complaints about they think there's an invasive species that's on their neighbor's property, or they think they've seen an invasive species in a store, and we respond to those. So it's a bit of a lead into the compliance order that was issued this year. So this is a significant step. We do have the ability under the Invasive Species Act, the Provincial Act, to issue an order under Section 25, and the order can be used in times where we think on reasonable grounds a person has either committed an offense or is about to commit an offense under the Act or its regulations. And it can be issued to a person to try to bring them into compliance. So some of the things that can be done with a compliance order, we can direct people to stop engaging in a certain activity or refrain from engaging in a certain activity. We can also direct them to prevent the continuation or repetition of a contravention or an offense. And one of the interesting parts about this tool is that, of course, if you use it, there is an ability for the person who it's being issued to request a review. And that review would be asked of the minister. And so we don't, of course, issue these lightly. We, have a lot of consideration and policy input onto why we might consider using a compliance order, recognizing that, somebody could request a review and this could be a big deal. So the situation we used it in was specifically for someone who was offering to sell the aquatic invasive plant Brazilian Elodea on Kijiji. So it was a tip that we received. And as most of you may be aware, import, possession, transport, deposit, growing it and buying, selling, leasing, or trading of a prohibited species, which Brazilian Elodea is illegal. And it was interesting in this case, the plants were offered for sale because they were starting to crowd the aquarium that they were being kept in. So really the reason for selling them was just to make space for fish and other aquarium plants. So we did issue this order, which essentially directed the person to stop offering this plant for sale and to also dispose of the plant. And we did provide information or guidance on how to do that effectively without spreading it. And the person was quite cooperative. They have cleaned up the tank and also not offered for sale anymore Brazilian Elodea. Just want to spend a bit of time talking about our work with partners in law enforcement, and what I mean by that is some of the work we've been doing with the law enforcement committee, and it's not nullifying or making any less important the work that we do with fisheries and oceans as other partners in the province for ensuring that invasive species rules are being followed. But this part definitely focuses on some of the work that is being done through the Law Enforcement Committee. So what is the Law Enforcement Committee? So the Great Lakes Law Enforcement Committee, this is sort of a schematic of how the Law Enforcement Committee, and you can see that on the left here, fits in with some of the other aspects in terms of governance. And really, the Law Enforcement Committee is part of a larger structure. You can see that we do interact with the Secretariat, but we also provide information to the Council of Lake Committees. And the way this all sort of ties together is that the Council of Great Lakes Fisheries Agencies, which are fish chiefs, developed the Joint Strategic Plan, and the plan specifies the structure through which basin-wide fishery management decisions are accomplished under the Great Lakes. The Council of Lake Committees is comprised of senior level fishery managers, and they receive technical input from the lake committees, from the Law Enforcement Committee, and also from fish health committees and base management decisions on the information that they receive through that process. And all of these committees function with the support of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission Secretariat, which sits down here. So what is the Law Enforcement Committee? Essentially, you can see by this map, it's showing some of the members that are in the Law Enforcement Committee. So basically we have each of the 8 states, tribal groups that are involved, and also Ontario that have responsibilities for enforcement in the basin. There are a number of federal agencies with management responsibilities as well that are included. And the the key thing here is that the Great Lakes Basin can really only be as protected as the weakest regulation in the jurisdiction, and that's a concept that has come to the forefront many times through the years. So a local regulatory change, while it may be important to an individual jurisdiction, it's not effective alone in an interconnected basin like the Great Lakes. So violators essentially simply move to another location in the basin. And that's sort of the underpinning of some of the work that the Law Enforcement Committee does. So our mission statement is to protect, enhance, and promote the safe and wise use of the natural resource in the Great Lakes for present and future generations. What does the Law Committee do? It functions to serve as a conduit for the transfer of information between the fisheries managers and law enforcement agencies. And the reason for this is so that we can design and implement enforceable regulations. The committee identifies and then evaluates problems associated with illegal fishery activities in the Great Lakes Basin, and also through each subcommittee offers support to the respective agencies in their resolutions to combat these issues. And the terms of reference charge the committee to provide the Council of Lake Committees with the information necessary to develop cooperative procedures, which are practical, enforceable on the ground, and consistent regulations. And so just to comment on consistency amongst regulations, what are we talking about here? We're not talking about always having uniform regulations or the same regulations, but really what we mean is that the objectives of the regulations would attain the same outcome. So that if you have in one jurisdiction rules that say you can't possess snakehead, you would have similar rules in another jurisdiction to attain that objective as well. Maybe not worded in the same way, but the consistency of regulations is important, because otherwise the illegal activity just moves to places where regulations are not in place to protect against that. The Great Lakes Law Enforcement Committee has done a fair bit of work over the years on different aspects. Some of you may be familiar with the 2017 resolution that was ratified by the Conference of Great Lakes Governors and St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. It had a number of items underneath it, one of which was a regional approach to enforcement, and having the various jurisdictions sign this regional enforcement approach agreement. Many of these things have been completed over the years, where we can sort of fill in the blanks or step forward as a committee is what we're looking at now. And one of the most recent things that the Law Enforcement Committee has done is coordinated an educational outreach on red swamp crayfish. This was done in the last year, and I'll just give you a little bit of information on this. So I'm the person third from the right, and I was the co-chair, or I am the co-chair. Bob Strauss is the person on the far right, right here. He's the current chair, and under his guidance, we have sent these letters out. And so essentially, those businesses that we sent the letters to were identified as selling live red swamp crayfish, which is an activity that's illegal in many jurisdictions. Some of these were wholesale distributors, some were smaller retailers, some were very large retailers. Many of them were in the south and the southeastern U.S., where the red swamp are farmed and harvested. And the goal of doing this outreach activity, the letter was not sent out to anybody in Ontario, because currently it's not illegal to sell red swamp crayfish. But for the other jurisdictions, it was to educate these suppliers about the existence of laws that potentially prohibit their shipping and sale of red swamp crayfish. The letter also pointed out that the laws vary across a state, province, or country, and information, contact information was provided for each state in an addendum to this letter. So there was another attachment that identified who they could contact to get more information. So number one goal was to educate the suppliers about the existence of laws. The second goal was to have a centralized sort of repository where member agencies could go to see who had been contacted, and also so that we weren't duplicating the same educational effort. So part of enforcement is to ensure that a person or business is reasonably aware of the law before taking action. And this was a way that we could ensure they had been notified and have a record of that. And the third goal was to establish this educational process with an initial species. So this was really a bit of a test case for the Law Enforcement Committee. We decided on the red swamp at the time because we saw it showing up in large numbers in Ontario, and in some places in the States, illegal activity was still ongoing in terms of its sale. So using this as an initial process, we kind of worked out the kinks, and we are just starting the next phase where we're doing an educational approach, hopefully on 2 species under the least wanted list, the yabby and the marmo crab, so the marbled crayfish. The letter campaign has resulted in a lot of phone calls, which is positive. That's what we're looking for from this, and emails. So in particular to the states of Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And we do think this type of approach is working, and are looking forward to doing it on other species in the future. So I'd just like to open it up for any questions, comments, or items that you think we should discuss. I know we've got just a little bit of time left, but happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Brenda. So I know we are short on time, so I'll take the time to ask a few questions before we end the webinar. So the first question I have for you is, how many different pieces of legislation do conservation officers enforce?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. It's one we get asked quite frequently. When I first came to enforcement branch, I was quite surprised. So there's about 25, maybe more, pieces of legislation, separate and distinct, that officers are responsible for from a mandatory perspective. In terms of how many pieces of legislation total do we enforce, it's over 45. And so the difference is those 25 are sort of the key pieces that they're not ancillary to our work. What makes up the rest, going up to 45, and of course are pieces of legislation where we might be out doing an inspection under, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act, and we notice that there might be an infraction under, for example, the shipping regulation, so whether people have life jackets or not. So the total is just around 45, and mandatory is around 25.
Thank you. Another question is, how can we help prevent invasive species in our everyday life?
Well, that's a great question. So, you know, number one, I think, is the key piece is being aware. You know, being aware of what the rules are, and in some cases, you know, that's from an enforcement perspective, where we have power and authority to enforce a rule, but people can also be aware of invasive species that are not regulated per se, and they might be able to use best management practices to reduce or prevent the spread of invasive species. So step number one, I think, is making sure you understand what the rules are, being aware, being able to identify invasive species is important, because that's when you'll start noticing them if they occur. And one of the really important things, of course, that I know I've witnessed just in the last couple of weeks is that it really is often members of the public who are alerting us to, for example, the existence of a population of something out in the wild, whether it's water chestnut or water soldier or something in a store. So we really do rely on information coming in from the public. So awareness, I think, is key.
Thank you. So another question I have is, I often hear the question from parties concerned about aquatic invasive species, that there should be a requirement to wash boats at the US-Canada border. Do you know whether this was considered in the development of the Invasive Species Act or in strategies or actions?
Yes, so I was involved in some of the drafting of the legislation. My former colleague also had a significant role, Mark Robbins, but I know when we were working with policy colleagues to provide enforcement input when the legislation was being drafted, definitely those were things that were considered. And part of the, I think part of one of the reasons that hasn't been implemented just yet is just a landscape level change for Ontario. Certainly there are requirements that certain things can't come into the province, but the requirement to force people to clean their boats before entering was a significant one. And I know there was discussion about it, and certainly I think there's move into considering that as a further policy and legislation. And you may have noticed the environmental posting on that we had recently about considering whether boats could be named as carriers under the Invasive Species Act, and the consideration that mechanisms might be invoked to force people to clean those.
Okay, great. Another question I have, or if you could speak to what some of the more pressing demands that enforcement is seeking to implement in the near future, so new invasive species regulation, legislation, awareness, oversight.
Yeah, so as I was talking about in the presentation, currently we are moving forward to continue with this plan because we do have annual review. I can't really speak to the next few years, but I obviously think that aquatic invasive species would continue to be a priority, especially with the potential for new rules to come for Ontario. So I do think it will continue to be an active aspect of enforcement activities, but I don't know that for sure. We have had this, this priority in place since 2015. One thing I didn't mention is that this priority is actually emerging of a couple different action plans. So we did in the beginning, when we first knew that we were having a new Invasive Species Act, we had a specific element it was actually called the Invasive Species Act Implementation Plan for Enforcement Branch that was approved in the summer of 2016. And we also did have a biodiversity action plan, which was focused on the bait pathway in the 2015-2016 fiscal year. And they both were incorporated into the current plan. So, it's pretty hard to say that invasive species are a low risk. I do think it will continue to be something that we prioritize and work on in the future.
Okay, great. Another question is, what was the process for creating legislation for invasive species?
Oh goodness, I wish I could speak to that, but that's out of my realm of expertise. I have a general knowledge of it, but we could follow up with that question, and I can ask my policy contact to answer that question.
Okay. And this will be the final question of today. Are there any concern of invasive species in Northern Ontario, like James Bay region?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a fabulous question, because I can tell you one of the challenges that we have had, and so first of all, I probably can't answer it. I think probably somebody who works with EdMaps or mapping, or who's in the know about new detections is better to answer that question. However, from an enforcement context, one of the things that we have found quite challenging is that there is a perception that the north is pristine. It is not subject to invasive species. And it's been a bit of a challenge, not just with public awareness, but also with staff to make them aware that there are invasive species in the north of the province. It's not just a southern-based issue. It's not just around Toronto. So, I appreciate the opportunity to comment on that, because if you take some time and you look at any kind of a mapping program, like, for example, EdMaps, and you look up, well, let's say gobies or spiny water flea or zebra mussels, you will see there's lots of locations in the north that are infested, and it is not pristine. So we can't rest on the assumption that because places are remote that they are immune from having invasive species spread to them. Wherever people go, they take things with them. So it's open for spread of things that we don't want being spread around.
Okay, great. And just one final question, or if you can comment on this, are there guide or reference books, pamphlets available to the public?
Sorry, the quick reference ones?
It just says the guide or reference books, pamphlets available to the public.
Yeah, so, okay, I think maybe the person is referring to those quick reference books. Yeah, definitely. So you can actually download them online. I actually worked with a representative at the Invading Species Awareness Program to get copies of those quick reference books, but maybe as a follow-up to the presentation, I can send you the links, and we can just share those with the group, and then they can request them themselves.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so thank you again to Brenda for her very informative presentation today. And thank you all for tuning in. This webinar was recorded and will be posted on our website, invasivespeciescenter.ca. Just a reminder to please take a couple of minutes to fill out our survey. We would really appreciate it. And as a reminder, our next webinar will be Thursday, October 22nd at 1 p.m. So thanks everyone for attending today, and have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.